Thanks, Jenny. I would like to present Dr. Gregory Foltz. He received his PhD from the University of Maryland in 2003. He was a National Research Council postdoctoral associate at NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory from 2003 to 2006, and a research associate with the Joint Institute for the Study of the Atmosphere and Ocean at the University of Washington from 2006 to 2010, and currently since 2010, he has been an oceanographer in the Physical Oceanography Division at NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory. His research focuses on understanding the role of the tropical ocean in climate and extreme weather, of which he's a principal investigator of the prediction and research Morte Array in the tropical Atlantic, or Parada, northeastern extension, a project that maintains 4 surface moorings in the central and eastern tropical North Atlantic in order to improve understanding and prediction of ocean atmospheric variability in that region. Additionally, he was the lead author of the Tropical Atlantic Observing System Ocean Obs 19 Community White Paper that was published in Frontiers in Marine Science. That will be the presentation of this talk today. So we are very glad to have Gregory as one of our speakers in anticipation of our session on ocean observing systems at a summer meeting next week. And this is one of several seminars this week to help organize and inform our discussions for that meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Greg Foltz, who will be talking about the Tropical Atlantic Observing System. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Jenny. And also thanks to the POS panel for inviting me to talk about the Tropical Atlantic Observing System. So this is work that's been going on for about 2.5 years now. And it's resulted in a couple of papers that are listed below, and also a review document, a more comprehensive review that will be released soon. So this first paper is mainly focused on the Parada observing system, and then the second one that Michelle mentioned is the review paper for Ocean Obs 19. I'll focus mostly on the outcomes from this, and also discuss some recommendations from this larger review document. And this whole review process is being led by Clavar's Atlantic Region Panel. So for any observing system, one of the main goals, of course, is to benefit society, and in terms of monitoring and improved understanding and improved predictability of weather and climate. In the tropical Atlantic over the past couple of decades, as an example here, there have been several extreme events that have been linked to tropical Atlantic variability. For example, we had severe droughts in the Amazon in 2005 and 2010. These are also very active hurricane years in the Atlantic. And you can see that the sea surface temperature in the tropical North Atlantic, the black line, was much above normal during these years. During other years, we had severe Amazon floods when we had cooler SSTs in the tropical North Atlantic. So there's a clear connection there. And of course, there are also influences from the tropical Pacific as well. And going back farther in time, we've seen an increasing trend in hurricane maximum intensity, increasing frequency of coral bleaching, which is directly tied to SST increasing, and increasing frequency overall of Amazon droughts and floods. So we need an observing system that can help understand, monitor, and predict extreme events like this and how they might be changing. So as one example, high societal impact hurricanes, we know they're becoming more intense. The plot on the left there shows that overall the median intensity, the red line, doesn't show an increase, but if you look at the blue line, the higher quantiles, there's a significant increase in intensity of these stronger storms. And this trend is by far the strongest in the tropical Atlantic of any of the tropical cyclone basins, the major basins in the world. On the right, we've seen an increasing magnitude of hurricane rapid intensification over the past 30 years. You can see in the bottom, the colored symbols, especially the yellow and the reds and the purples indicating a high magnitude, large magnitudes of rapid intensification. You see more of these in the most recent 15-year period. So this magnitude has been increasing, and this can be a problem if they intensify rapidly near land, for example. And these trends are connected to the underlying ocean, of course, the increasing sea surface temperature and ocean heat content. Another quick example, this one in terms of ecosystems, in the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean, we've seen a significant increase in the coverage of sargassum, a floating seaweed. And this can cause problems. You can see this figure on the bottom right. If it goes up on beaches, for example, tourist beaches, and it also affects ecosystems in ways that we're not completely sure of. So the top plot here shows in 2011, basically we had this event and all this sargassum was started showing up at lower latitudes, and it's gotten more and more higher coverage since. And it's thought to be caused by an extreme negative NAO event in 2011. And what this did was it forced the westerly winds, forced sargassum eastward and also southward into lower latitudes and into the Caribbean. And this shows two pathways, one direct pathway, the blue trajectories, and one more indirect going to the east and then around to the west into the Caribbean. So we need an observing system that can monitor and help understand things like this in terms of biology, ecosystems, and how they're connected to biogeochemistry and physical parameters. All right, so the science, what are the science drivers that can affect these societally important events? And so this shows a quick schematic. And of course, like any tropical ocean basin, it's pretty complicated. We have climate modes internal to the tropical Atlantic, and these interact with the Pacific through ENSO and the PDO, for example, through atmospheric teleconnections. We have connections to the extratropical Atlantic through the NAO and multi-decadal variability, for example. And of course, the AMOC runs through the tropical Atlantic, can influence tropical Atlantic variability, and there are two-way interactions there. The warm pool impacts precipitation in North America, and cold tongue is the productive, biologically productive region and is subject to interannual variability that can interfere with this. So it's a complicated task coming up with an observing system to monitor and help understand all these processes. All right, so a brief review here of tropical Atlantic climate modes. The large-scale modes, we have two that are dominant on interannual to decadal timescales, the meridional mode and the zonal mode. The meridional mode is mainly an anomalous meridional gradient of SST, and this shows an example of a strong event, negative event that happened in 2009, and this caused a displacement, an anomalous displacement of the ITCZ to the south, causing severe flooding in northeast Brazil. And if we go back in time, we see a strong anti-correlation between rainfall in northeast Brazil and the meridional mode. The zonal mode, this is more like the ENSO in the Pacific. It's concentrated in the eastern equatorial Atlantic. The contours are sea level, so this is deepening of thermocline, reduction in upwelling and mixing, causes rainfall anomalies mainly in the Gulf of Guinea and Western Africa, and has variability on interannual timescales. And both of these affect hurricane activity as well. We're finding the zonal mode also does, in addition to the meridional mode, mainly in the eastern hurricane development region. And then, of course, on longer timescales, the multi-decadal oscillation, which is well known and impacts rainfall over North America, South America, Africa, and hurricane activity. Okay, also, in addition to these large-scale modes, we need to understand at a more fundamental level the processes at play. We know there's strong mesoscale, submesoscale variability in the global ocean, and this is true in the tropical Atlantic. This shows observations of a strong submesoscale vortex in the northeastern tropical Atlantic. And you can see there's strong shear velocity, stratification changes, and these can affect mixing and air-sea interactions in ways that are not completely understood. And they're thought to play a role in maintaining the oxygen minimum zone in that area. Surface heat flux, we need to know. There's a lot of uncertainty in the tropics. The standard deviation here between 12 different satellite and reanalysis products is between about 20 and 30 watts per square meter in the tropics. This can make it difficult to quantify things like the heat budget. This is shown here at one location from one mooring. And the vertical mixing term, we normally can't calculate this very well from observations, and is estimated as a residual, this dashed orange line here between the storage and the sum of the other terms. But there's uncertainty in this, so we need direct observations. And the red here shows some recent observations from microstructure turbulence. And if you look at most of the red dots, they're close to zero. So you might say, well, there's hardly any mixing, hardly any cooling. But then there's this one event, about 250 watts per square meter, in this case, driven by near inertial wave. And so then you start to say, well, maybe there is actually strong seasonal cycle. And we need to understand this better. We don't have nearly enough observations of mixing and the processes that drive them, especially off the equator. Okay, moving on to hurricanes. So we know that SST is important. Heat content, of course, is important. SST especially directly affects thermodynamics of hurricanes, cause them to intensify. But we're finding that salinity can also be important. And in this Amazon plume region, and this bottom left plot shows the number of tropical cyclones that have intensified locally to category 4 and 5. And you see a bullseye over the Amazon Orinoco plume, the black contour. And the idea is that the salinity stratification can reduce mixing and reduce cooling as the storm goes by and contribute to intensification. On the right is another study, and this shows that for rapidly intensifying storms, salinity is important. The bottom right shows that the differences in salinity stratification for rapidly intensifying versus non-rapidly intensifying. And there's a big increase, significant increase in salinity stratification and lower surface salinity for the rapidly intensifying storms east of 70 west. To the west, where salinity doesn't vary as much as you might expect, temperature and heat content are more important. So we need to observe the subsurface ocean temperature and salinity, especially in the Western Basin, to understand these interactions. Okay, biogeochemistry, briefly, we know there are expanding oxygen minimum zones in the northeastern, equatorial, and southeastern tropical Atlantic. We don't know exactly what's causing these expansions, although climate change and natural variability, of course, can both play a role. We don't know the consequences for ecosystems or how these oxygen minimum zones generally are maintained. So the upper right plot then shows to the west in the Amazon plume region that the Amazon plume waters can enhance nitrogen fixation, and this leads to a big carbon drawdown, this big arrow for the middle water here, and can have implications for the carbon cycle in ways that are not completely known. And again, we have very, very few direct measurements of biology and biogeochemistry in the tropical Atlantic, so it makes it difficult to monitor and understand these processes. And the bottom right shows an extreme warming event in the tropical Atlantic in 2010, and this caused anomalous outgassing of CO2. This is the surface atmospheric carbon dioxide partial pressure. And these are anomalies using a model. And again, we need observations. There are very few direct observations to kind of validate these models and understand these changes in the CO2 fluxes and implications for the carbon cycle. We have a large coupled model biases in the tropical Atlantic. These have been around for decades and haven't been solved. The shading indicates rainfall biases, and the contours are SST biases. So this shows that even if you force an atmosphere-only model with the observed SST, you still have biases. So it's not, it's complicated. It's not just the ocean model problem. It's not the atmosphere. It appears to be a combination of both. And looking at the SST bias, this is largest in the summer, the bottom left panel, these SST biases. A recent study looked at one of these moorings where this SST bias is very large and ran a 1D coupled model and showed that the observed SST, you can model and match the observed SST pretty well, only if you kind of tune the vertical diffusion coefficient. And this suggests that this vertical mixing misrepresentation in the model, at least in this model, may contribute significantly to this SST bias. And more work, especially more direct observations in this area, are needed to further understand this and hopefully correct the models. All right, so that is some motivation And now I'll get into the observing system. So traditionally, we've used ships and moorings and satellites as the observing system. And then since the 1990s and 2000s, we've had more surface drifters and Argo floats, which have really helped to fill in the observing system. And then more recently, we've seen fully autonomous platforms such as gliders and sail drones, and these are also very promising and have been helping a lot to fill in gaps in the observing system. So if we look over the past 20 years, there's been a lot of progress in building up and sustaining the observing system. So this shows the differences between the 2 decades, the most recent and the decade before. And one thing you can notice is that there have been a lot of additional measurements added to the Parada moorings in the most recent decade. So the Parada moorings are the red and the blue squares. And then these additional measurements are the colored circles next to the moorings. So some examples, there have been ocean tracking network sensors added to every Parada mooring, the light blue circles, and these measure aquatic life, such as fish, and their migration patterns and their abundance. So these are at every oxygen measurements in the ocean. In the northeastern basin, the orange circles, we have some atmospheric CO2 measurements at a few locations. Additional current meters to look at the current shear in the upper ocean at one mooring. On the equator, we now have 3 ADCPs, and we have microstructure measurements from kypods. The purple circles, this is a Oregon State project, and the Germans contribute the oxygen measurements. So this is an advantage, really, of having this sustained observing system, is that other institutions, other countries can add on and add a lot of value to the sustained observing system. Also notice, of course, a big increase in the coverage of Argo floats, the shading, and deep and biogeochemistry Argo floats. The bold triangles have also started, those programs have started recently. And in terms of satellite data, a big plus is satellite salinity, which has come on in the past decade. So the red squares here, also, we now have a real-time transfer of hourly data from many of the moorings, the ones colored in red. And this helps with assimilating into weather forecast models and can help, especially with prediction of weather and hurricanes. All right, so that's good. We've made progress, but now I'll get into some more critical assessments of the observing system. And to start, I'll look at, as an example, the mixed layer heat budget. If we want to understand the mixed layer heat budget, what does the observing system look like? And this shows now that the shading is the heat budget residual from satellite data and Argo. And this is an estimate of this vertical cooling, vertical mixing term, which is difficult to measure. So overall, most of the Parada moorings have a lot of the measurements we need to quantify the heat budget, but they have generally poor vertical resolution, temperature, and salinity in the upper ocean, 20 to 80 meter resolution sometimes, which is not nearly enough to resolve things like the mixed layer depth and the stratification below it. There are also a very limited upper ocean velocity measurements. We have point current meters at 10 meters depth at many of the moorings, the ones without X's, but we have no information of the vertical structure of velocity except on the equator. We also have no direct measurements of turbulent heat fluxes at the surface. We have to rely on bulk algorithms. And there are no long-wave radiation measurements at many of the moorings, only the ones with the yellow squares have long wave. So we can't really calculate the full surface heat flux. We have limited measurements in important regions like the northwestern tropical Atlantic, where we know that the subsurface ocean can contribute to things like hurricane intensification. We also have very limited measurements in the southeastern tropical Atlantic, where there are low clouds and aerosols, and there are big warm biases in the coupled models. And turbulence measurements, mixing measurements, we have some on the equator now, which is good. And these white lines indicate cruise tracks with microstructure profiles. but you'll see that they're all concentrated in the eastern equatorial Atlantic. We need additional measurements off the equator to understand significant seasonality, possibly of mixing and what causes it. For ocean circulation, so again, the piranha moorings, we have velocity measurements at 1 point depth, usually 10 meters or 12 meters, and many of them, the ones without the X's. But again, we don't have much information on the vertical structure of velocity. There are repeat cruises. The orange are from Parada service and cruises, and the green lines are from Ghost Ship, and these generally have full depth velocity profiles, but these are only once a decade for the Ghost Ship and about once a year for the Parada cruises. The western boundary currents are measured at 2 arrays, one at 16 north, which measures the deep western boundary current, and at 11 south, the German project, which measures both the deep and the upper limbs of the AMOC at the boundaries, and also that it has inverted echo sounders, which can get an estimate of the full transport across the basin. But in general, the boundary currents are not well sampled, especially considering their importance for things like upwelling and ecosystems and the AMOC. Limited full depth velocity measurements, very few measurements near the equator. The shading shows the drifter coverage, and of course they diverge, and we don't get many measurements on the equator except the moorings. And okay, so hurricanes, another important topic. We would like to have an observing system that can monitor and better understand hurricane-ocean interactions. The shading is the number of tropical cyclones that pass through any 1 degree box going back to 1989. And as this track density increases westward, we find that we have very limited subsurface ocean measurements. The moorings that have subsurface are indicated by the yellow squares, Parada and NTAS, and then to the west, we really only have surface meteorological buoys, the red squares with circles around them. And we have some gliders. The blue tracks are from underwater gliders, which give good information around the Caribbean islands. But in general, a big gap in the observing system here in the Western Atlantic. Also, some Parada moorings don't measure surface pressure, the ones without circles around them. And we know that surface pressure is very important for assimilating into forecast models and can help with things like hurricane forecasts and more generally weather forecasts. And many drifters do not measure, about 40% do not measure surface pressure. So that's a clear way to enhance the observing system, is to add barometers to these. And finally, the biogeochemistry. So this is really severely undersampled compared to the physical parameters. You can see on the right here the number of the tracks and the number of data points color-coded by oxygen and nitrate, and there's really big gaps, mainly data from cruises and very few so surface CO2 measurements, very limited, especially in the South Atlantic, the bottom plot, and getting a little better toward the north, and very few biological measurements. And we need these to link the physical biogeochemical state to things like fish stocks, which are important, of course. And we need the whole chain, the whole chain of biology, from plankton up to marine mammals and fish. So we'll get to the recommendations. So again, this is from this OceanObs white paper, and also from the more extensive review that's going to come out soon and be available to the public. So one of the important ones is to maintain the records that have proven value. This is very important. Improve the vertical resolution, as I mentioned, on measurements in the mixed layer and below, and put full surface flux measurements, near surface current meters on all moorings, ideally. And this is similar to recommendations for the tropical Pacific observing system. Augment more drifting buoys with barometers, which I mentioned. This can help with weather forecasts. And an idea is to seed some into northeastern basin before the hurricane season. They'll then drift westward and help during the hurricane season where they're needed. And we could explore things like thermistor chain drifters, because the drifters diverge. If you put a thermistor chain down lower, the integrated drift velocity might be a lot lower than the surface velocity, so you can get better, more measurements that stay on the equator of the subsurface. Sustained measurements of upwelling mixing and the processes that drive it are definitely needed on and off the equator. Satellite capability for surface currents, the SCIM project, for example, could be potentially extremely valuable, especially because we don't have geostrophy on the equator. We don't have good estimates of currents from things like altimetry and winds. We need an increased emphasis on multidisciplinary measurements from cruises. This is an obvious one because we're spending a lot of money and time to put these ships out there. We might as well make full use of them and make biogeochemical and biological measurements from them. As I mentioned, expand the in situ observing system into the northwest and southeastern tropical Atlantic for hurricanes and model biases and many other processes. High resolution wind measurements in the southeastern region. Satellite winds can't get close enough to the coast. There may be big biases in the winds, which can drive biases in upwelling and cause SST biases. And increased use of autonomous platforms, especially near land, near boundaries, would be very valuable. And continue expansion of biogeochemical, biological measurements, adding sensors to the Parada moorings. For example, dissolved oxygen, pH, and nitrate would be very helpful. And finally, in terms of ecosystems, we need to extend surveys for commercial and endangered species, and especially we need to integrate these surveys, which are currently kind of done in a non-integrated fashion, just by individual countries, individual organizations. So that's a big problem, and this probably involves capacity building, especially Africa, which of course is a challenge, but this is very valuable if this could be accomplished. Process studies, which I didn't mention a lot, but these are needed, as again, similar to the tropical Pacific, needed to inform the sustained observing system, what it should look like. I didn't mention this much because there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't really know what the assimilation systems need in terms of observations in a lot of cases. And this is because there are deficiencies in the assimilation systems in getting the data in and getting the most value out of the data. So we need studies on how to effectively assimilate observations into models. And finally, something that's common to any observing system, we need greater integration, more consistent standards and best practices, for example, quality control, making data available in the same format so that it's useful to all the users, making it available in a timely manner, and just generally improvement in the data management issues. And with that, I will end and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Reminder, if you have a question, use the raise your hand button, which is next to your name in the participant list. Otherwise, you could type your question into the chat box. All right, I see a question from Antonietta. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for this great overview of the system. So I actually have a few questions. I'll try to be brief. So one is, so this is a review that was initiated by the Cliver Atlantic panel, if you said. So do you have, so was just a review, or is there also an implementation plan for, so this is a set of recommendations, but is there a plan for implementing them, and who would support the
Yeah. No. So it's not as far along as the Pacific TPOS, definitely, and probably not as far along as the Indian Ocean Observing System Review in that sense. So far, this is really just kind of the early stages. Figuring out what observations we have and what we need, and so far, not too much of a critical. Not trying to redesign necessarily, but just come up with the best integrated system. And there have been some additional observations funded in the tropical Atlantic through Atlantos. This is the Atlantic the Atlantic-wide observing systems review. And they funded things like, enhancing drifter coverage in the South Atlantic and putting additional sensors, biogeochemical and physical sensors on moorings and boundary current ADCP, things like that. So I anticipate there will be more through the Taos community in terms of, actual funding for making improvements to the observing system.
Yeah. In fact, my other question was about the relationship with Atlantos. So Atlantos is this big, project for the whole Atlantic. So there has been a close communication between you and between Taos, the Taos group and Atlantos?
Yes, yeah. So there has been communication. Yeah, like I said, I mean, that's informed, we've informed each other's plans, I think, basically. And Atlantis has now ended. It ended last year. So I think it'll kind of pass on, and we'll learn from Atlantis and in redesigning or, at least improving the tropical Atlantic observing system. That's the hope.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, a question from Chidong. Go ahead, Chidong.
Thank you, Jenny. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Greg. One biggest challenge of observing the global ocean is actually not within the ocean, is in the atmosphere boundary layer. NASA has put, the decadal survey has include this problem as one of their focus, but it will take years for them to develop effective satellite observations of the marine boundary layer of the atmosphere. I wonder, this is a very general problem that cover all the world ocean. I wonder whether there has been any discussion within the Atlantic community on this subject, and what's the current thought? Any idea to take advantage of the new technologies of autonomous devices to solve this problem in the near term?
Yeah, so it's definitely a problem that's been discussed in terms of getting the boundary layer, the near surface parameters, especially that you need to calculate turbulent heat fluxes, is very important, and it's been discussed. And I believe there are efforts to retrieve humidity and temperature near the surface from satellites, based on some discussions. I don't know how far along they are. So we support that fully. And in terms of autonomous vehicles, that's another recommendation that we have is to increase use of autonomous vehicles, which could be very helpful, especially for things like this, where we don't have, especially direct flux measurements and measurements of surface parameters over a large area that you can't get from things like moorings. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
But actually, the more difficult issue is not just the surface, is the boundary layer in the atmosphere from surface to, for example, 1 kilometer.
Yes. So yeah, and that, one of the thoughts is that could be causing a lot of the coupled model biases in the Atlantic, in the Western Atlantic. So, that's something I think that might be a good process study that could inform the observing system. And but I have to admit that this review has focused mainly on the ocean and near surface, so there hasn't been a lot of discussion on the the boundary layer above the surface. Hopefully that'll come later. That's an important. I know it was a big part of the TPOS review, so it should be considered.
All right, I see a question from Shane. Go ahead.
Hi, Greg. This is Shane Lipo. Thank you very much for your presentation today. I think one of the things you recommended and that you mentioned is that increased multidisciplinary cruises or projects as part of the observing system. So what practical mechanisms do you see to make that happen?
Well, okay, so we've had some progress on that in terms of the Parada cruises, which are about once a year, and our Brazilian and French colleagues are ahead of us on this. They have, you know, they measure nutrients and things like chlorophyll, and you know, even some biological parameters routinely during the cruises. So I'm thinking just, just basic things like that, which would not be, in terms of funding, wouldn't require too much and could add a lot of value to the observing system.
So you would encourage people to write proposal and say, here, there's a cruise happening, we could just piggyback, there's birth available on these cruises.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. That's one way to do it, and that's been done. That's been done a lot actually with the Parada moorings, putting on kind of process study temporary measurements. I think a more effective way would be to find funding for more sustained, like annual servicing cruises, or putting them more permanently on the moorings to measure, and that way you don't have to worry about getting funding for shorter duration. The sustained aspect of it, I think, is very important. But these shorter programs to start and to figure out what we need would also be very helpful, I think.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Can we take one more question, Greg? See that we're a little okay. Question from Anish. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Greg, for the overview. That was really useful for the panel discussion. So I was wondering about the engagement from operational centers, like operational weather forecasting centers, in this effort, both on the review side and also going forward on the implementation side. I know that for the TPOS, there's a lot of interest from operational NOAA efforts that it would help improving forecasts over US on subseasonal and seasonal timescale. Similarly, is there interest both from the US and the European side in terms of not only from the reanalysis side, but from assimilating the observations for forecasting weather over US and Europe? And have they been involved in setting up experiments like observation sensitivity experiments?
Yes, yeah. So again, I think the Europeans are ahead of us on this. They have I believe through Atlantis, actually, they have funded projects to look at, for example, the value of Parada for ocean model initialization, data assimilation, that kind of thing. And so that is being done and has been done, but it's difficult because, like I mentioned, it's not clear that the assimilation systems are set up correctly to incorporate things like point measurements from moorings, and that's one thing that needs to be worked on, and some effort needs to be spent on that, I think, to get a fair assessment of the importance of the observations. But yes, there is interest, active engagement of the operational centers in Europe, Météo France, and in the US, the National Hurricane Center has contributed a lot to the review of the observing system, especially in the Western Atlantic, of course, where hurricanes pass through, and they are very, pushing for more in situ measurements of the surface atmosphere and even the subsurface ocean to improve prediction of hurricanes in that region. So, yeah, there has been a lot of input from some operational centers.
Okay, thanks. So would you recommend that there should be more done from the US side in terms of funding projects for testing improvement in forecasts, or there is enough of that?
Yes, I do think there should be more involvement from the US. As far as I know, it's all on the European side so far in terms of looking at the sustained observing system.
Thanks.
All right, I think we'll end today's webinar here at this point. So thank you, Greg, for presenting, and thank you for everyone who joined and ask some questions. We will resume the POS panel webinar tomorrow at the same time, and we'll have Patrick Heimbach present. So I will send an announcement out then, and then this webinar was recorded, so I will send that most likely later this week. So thank you everyone for joining.